I mean, there was always those groups in the 70s, they made these superstar groups, and we hated that, you know, the idea of these famous people.
He was the quiet force behind one of the biggest bands in history, the Beatles. While Lennon and McCartney took centre stage, George Harrison quietly shaped the sound that changed music forever. But beneath his calm exterior was a story of frustration, rivalry, and a spiritual journey that few truly understood. Who did George Harrison really resent, and why? What was the truth behind the tensions that simmered within the Fab Four?
You're going to jail, pal. What is that? What do you think you have there? You broke the law.
He was often seen as the quiet one. Among the four Beatles, George Harrison stood apart, not because he lacked talent or drive, but because he chose a different path, one that didn't always need the spotlight. While John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote most of the group's biggest hits and often dominated public attention, Harrison was steadily carving out his own identity within the band. Quiet, yes, but passive? Far from it. Over time, George's quiet nature masked a deep internal frustration that would slowly rise to the surface. Understanding George Harrison means looking beyond the surface charm of the Beatles and into the life of a musician who spent much of his time searching not just for artistic space, but also for spiritual and personal peace. George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, in Wavertree, a suburb of Liverpool, England. He was the youngest of four children in a working-class family. His father, Harold, was a bus conductor who had previously worked as a ship's steward. His mother, Louise, came from Irish Catholic roots and worked as a shop assistant. The Harrisons lived at 12 Arnold Grove, a small terraced house with basic amenities, an outdoor toilet, no central heating, and just a single coal fire to warm the entire house. Despite these modest beginnings, the Harrison household was full of love and music. George's mother played an especially important role in nurturing his interest in music. She was known for her joyful singing voice, often filling their home with sound. According to biographer Joshua Greene, Louise would listen to Radio India during her pregnancy, drawn to the spiritual melodies of sitars and tablas, hoping that the calming tones would somehow influence the baby growing inside her. Whether or not this had any direct impact, the sounds of Indian music would one day play a major role in George's life and career. The family moved to a council house at 25 Upton Green in Speke in 1949. It was there that George started school, first at Dovedale Primary, then later at Liverpool Institute High School for Boys, where he met Paul McCartney. While the school had a music program, George found it uninspiring, particularly because there were no guitars, which were quickly becoming his obsession. He would often draw guitars in his notebooks and dream of playing one on stage. He once said he was totally into guitars, and this passion only grew stronger with time. As a child, George was captivated by a range of music. He listened to George Formby, Django Reinhardt, Hoagy Carmichael, and American artists like Carl Perkins and Cab Calloway. But the moment that truly changed everything for him came in early 1956. He was riding his bicycle past a house when he heard a song drifting out of a nearby window. Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel. That sound, raw, emotional, and new, stopped him in his tracks. It was George's first real experience of rock and roll, and from that moment he was hooked. At around 14 years old, George took a practical step toward making music his reality. A friend offered to sell him a second-hand guitar for £3 sterling 10 pence. His mother bought it for him, and that small act of support helped kickstart what would become a world-famous musical journey. A family friend taught him basic chords and songs like Whispering, Sweet Sue, and Dinah. George learnt quickly, and not long after, he formed a skiffle band called the Rebels with his older brother Peter and a friend named Arthur Kelly. Inspired by Lonnie Donegan, skiffle music gave George his first experience of playing in a group. It was around this time, during his bus rides to school, that George began to talk with Paul McCartney. Paul was a couple of years older, but they shared a passion for music and guitar playing. They bonded over trying out new chords and admiring American rock and roll acts. That friendship, formed in their teenage years, laid the groundwork for something much bigger. In 1958, Paul introduced George to John Lennon, who was leading a skiffle group called the Quarrymen. Lennon initially thought George was too young to join the group. George had just turned 15, but McCartney arranged a second audition. The story goes that George impressed Lennon by playing the lead guitar part of the instrumental Raunchy right there on a bus. It was enough to convince Lennon to let him in. From there, George became a regular part of the Quarrymen, which would eventually become the Beatles. George's father had hoped he would stick to a steady career path, and for a short time George worked as an apprentice electrician at Blacklers, a department store in Liverpool. But music was calling. He adopted the stage name Carl Harrison during their early tours in Scotland, a tribute to Carl Perkins, one of his musical idols. By 1960, George was performing regularly with the Beatles during their early days in Hamburg, Germany. These Hamburg shows were crucial for shaping the band's sound and stamina. Playing long sets every night, the Beatles grew tighter as a group. But not everything went smoothly. Because George was underage, he was deported by German authorities for working in nightclubs illegally, cutting the trip short. Still, the Hamburg experience left a lasting impression and marked the beginning of the Beatles' rise. When Brian Epstein became the band's manager in late 1961, everything changed. Epstein polished their image, got them signed to EMI, and helped them land their first recording sessions. Their debut single, Love Me Do, came out in 1962 and reached number 17 on the charts. It was a modest success, but it opened the door for what came next. Their first album, Please Please Me, was released in 1963 and quickly made them national stars in the UK. George Harrison, although not in the songwriting spotlight like Lennon and McCartney, was a key figure in shaping their sound. As Beatlemania exploded across the globe, Harrison became known as the Quiet Beatle. This nickname stuck partly because he was naturally reserved, but also because during the band's early US tour in 1964, George was battling a bad case of strep throat. He was under strict orders to save his voice for their iconic performance on The Ed Sullivan Show. That moment helped cement the group's place in American pop culture and George's quiet, mysterious image. While the press loved to play up the contrast between the bandmates, George didn't mind being called quiet. He found some amusement in it, and over time he embraced the role. But behind the scenes, he was evolving, not just as a guitarist, but also as a songwriter. His early contributions were modest. On the Beatles' debut album, he had 2 lead vocals, including Do You Want to Know a Secret?, which was written for him by Lennon and McCartney. By the time With the Beatles came out later that same year, Harrison had written and sung his first original Beatles song, Don't Bother Me. George Harrison also became something of a musical scout for the band. He was always on the lookout for new sounds and genres, particularly from the United States. By 1965, his musical taste was shifting, and he brought those influences into the Beatles' evolving sound. That year's album, Rubber Soul, reflected a growing interest in folk rock, inspired by artists like the Byrds and Bob Dylan. It also marked the first time George experimented with Indian music on a Beatles track. That track was Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, which featured a sitar played by George himself. It was a bold move at the time, bringing an unfamiliar Eastern instrument into Western pop music, and it showed that Harrison was not afraid to push boundaries. Years later, he would call Rubber Soul his favorite Beatles album, perhaps because it marked the beginning of his transformation into a more confident and innovative artist. The early years of George Harrison's life and career were filled with quiet determination, musical curiosity, and a growing desire to be heard. He may have started out as the youngest and least dominant member of the Beatles, but he was already planting the seeds of a legacy that would go far beyond just being the quiet one. His journey was only just beginning. As the Beatles entered the mid-1960s, something shifted in George Harrison. Having spent years in the shadow of John Lennon and Paul McCartney's prolific songwriting, he began looking outward for creative and personal inspiration. The Beatles were evolving rapidly, both musically and culturally, and George's search for meaning was about to take him on a path that none of the other members had yet traveled. In 1965, while filming the Beatles' second feature film, Help, a crucial moment occurred that would change Harrison's life. One scene in the film featured an Indian restaurant, and during filming, George noticed a group of musicians playing traditional Indian instruments. Among them was the sitar, which immediately caught his attention. The sound was unlike anything he had heard before in Western music. Hypnotic, twangy, and deeply expressive, something about it struck a chord. That same year, while recording the track Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, for the album Rubber Soul, Harrison decided to use a sitar on a Beatles song for the first time. It was the first use of the instrument on a mainstream Western pop record, and it marked the start of Harrison's long and public connection to Indian music and culture. While John Lennon wrote the song, it was Harrison's sitar that gave it a haunting and unique sound. The track stood out not just within the Beatles' discography, but within the broader landscape of popular music at the time. Harrison's interest in Indian culture quickly deepened. He wasn't simply using the sitar as a novelty or background texture, he wanted to understand it. That led him to Ravi Shankar, a world-renowned sitar virtuoso. George approached him not as a celebrity seeking a quick lesson, but as a humble student. Shankar was initially hesitant about teaching someone from the pop world, but Harrison's sincerity won him over. In 1966, George began formal study with Shankar, immersing himself in the music, discipline, and philosophy of classical Indian traditions. His time with Ravi Shankar went beyond music. Through their conversations, Harrison was introduced to aspects of Indian spirituality, including Hinduism, meditation, and the Bhagavad Gita. For George, this wasn't just an intellectual curiosity, it was a turning point. He began to question many of the values he had grown up with in the West, particularly the materialism and fame that had come with being a Beatle. Fame, once thrilling, had started to feel hollow. In Indian philosophy, he found something more enduring, something that resonated with his inner restlessness. By the time Revolver was released in 1966, Harrison had written 3 tracks for the album: Taxman, Love You Too, and I Want to Tell You. Love You Too in particular demonstrated just how much he had embraced Indian music, as it featured traditional instrumentation and structure. George wasn't dabbling anymore. He was actively fusing his Western rock roots with his new influences from the East. But the more spiritually engaged Harrison became, the more he found himself pulling away from the fast-paced, fame-driven world the Beatles had built. Around this time, the group had stopped touring, partly due to increasing safety concerns and the exhausting schedule, but also because the band's live performances no longer felt creatively fulfilling. For Harrison, this pause allowed him to spend more time studying Indian music, reading spiritual texts, and developing his identity outside of the Beatles. In 1967, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, widely regarded as one of the greatest albums in music history. While Lennon and McCartney's songwriting dominated the album, Harrison contributed a standout track, Within You, Without You. The song, heavily influenced by Indian classical music, was not a crowd pleaser in the traditional sense. It was philosophical and meditative, layered with sitars and tablas. For some listeners, it was a curious detour. For others, a bold artistic statement. Either way, it showed just how far George had come. He was no longer simply the Beatles' lead guitarist. He was emerging as a voice with something meaningful to say. That same year, the Beatles had a highly publicized trip to India to study transcendental meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. While the media coverage often reduced the event to a quirky celebrity adventure, the experience had genuine importance for Harrison. He was deeply committed to his spiritual journey, more so than the other band members. In interviews and later writings, he often said that India had given him something that the West could not: a sense of peace, clarity, and purpose. Back in England, Harrison's spiritual beliefs began influencing other areas of his life. He became a vegetarian, began chanting mantras, and started spending more time at home or with like-minded friends, rather than in the bustling social scene of London. He also introduced the other Beatles to new sounds and concepts, helping to steer the band toward more experimental and reflective music. But this period wasn't without conflict. As George became more confident in his musical and personal identity, tensions within the band grew. The creative partnership of Lennon and McCartney still dominated the Beatles' direction, and George's contributions were often overlooked or dismissed. Despite his growth as a songwriter, he was typically allowed only 1 or 2 songs per album, a limitation that increasingly frustrated him. This tension reached a peak during the sessions for the White Album in 1968. George had written several songs he believed were strong, while My Guitar Gently Weeps being a prime example, but getting them recorded was the struggle. To bring that song to life, Harrison brought in Eric Clapton to play the guitar solo, marking the first time an outside guitarist was featured on a Beatles track. Clapton's involvement helped the others take the song more seriously, and it became one of the album's highlights. During the same sessions, Harrison recorded other tracks that showed his increasing maturity as a songwriter, including Piggies and Long, Long, Long. But despite these artistic gains, the working environment within the band was becoming more strained. Disagreements over creative control, business matters, and personal differences were beginning to surface more often. By the time the Beatles began work on Let It Be, the fractures within the group were hard to ignore. The sessions were marked by tension, and George even walked out at one point, temporarily quitting the band. He returned a few days later, but only after certain conditions were met, one of which was that he be given more freedom over his contributions. While he still found himself sidelined at times, Harrison was beginning to stand his ground. Throughout this period, George was also developing material outside of the Beatles. In 1968, he released a solo album called Wonderwall Music, a mostly instrumental soundtrack that blended Indian music with Western rock. It was followed by Electronic Sound in 1969, a more experimental record that delved into the possibilities of the Moog synthesizer. Though neither project was a commercial blockbuster, they showed that Harrison was thinking beyond the Beatles and starting to envision a musical life of his own. Another major milestone came in 1969 with the release of Abbey Road. George contributed 2 of the album's most acclaimed songs, Something and Here Comes the Sun. Something, in particular, was a breakthrough. Frank Sinatra famously called it the greatest love song of the past 50 years, and, for the first time, Harrison had written a Beatles single that was embraced on par with Lennon and McCartney's best work. It reached number 1 on the US charts and was widely praised by critics and fans alike. Here Comes the Sun was equally celebrated, a hopeful, melodic track that captured a sense of renewal and optimism. Written at a time when Harrison felt burdened by the Beatles' growing business problems, the song reflected his desire to move beyond stress and towards something lighter and more joyful. It was recorded using a Moog synthesizer, one of the earliest examples of the instrument being used in popular music, and once again highlighted Harrison's willingness to experiment. By the end of the 1960s, George Harrison had transformed from the shy youngest member of the Beatles into an artist with a fully formed musical and spiritual identity. His songwriting was gaining recognition, his musical curiosity was expanding, and his personal search for meaning had set him apart, not just from his bandmates, but from many of his contemporaries in the music world. Still, the road ahead would not be without difficulty. The Beatles were beginning to unravel, and George would soon have to navigate a world where the band no longer existed. But he was ready. He had spent years preparing for the moment when he could finally step out on his own. When the Beatles officially broke up in 1970, the music world shifted. The band had been a dominant cultural force for nearly a decade, and their split left a vacuum. Each member went on to pursue their own projects, but for George Harrison, this moment felt like a long-awaited liberation. No longer limited to 1 or 2 songs per album, or forced to navigate the creative hierarchy of Lennon and McCartney, he finally had the space to express himself fully, and he wasted no time in doing so. In November 1970, Harrison released his first post-Beatles solo album, All Things Must Pass. It was a triple LP, a bold move for a debut solo project. But Harrison had built up a backlog of songs over the years, tracks that hadn't made it onto Beatles records, often because they had been dismissed or overlooked. Now, with complete creative freedom, he was able to shape them into a cohesive body of work. The album was met with widespread acclaim. Critics praised its depth, emotional honesty, and spiritual themes. Songs like My Sweet Lord, What Is Life, Isn't It a Pity, and the title track, All Things Must Pass, demonstrated Harrison's songwriting strength and individuality. My Sweet Lord, in particular, became a global hit. The song fused gospel-inspired choruses with Hindu mantras, reflecting George's ongoing spiritual exploration. It became the first solo single by a Beatle to reach #1 on the US and UK charts. The success of All Things Must Pass surprised many, not because people doubted Harrison's talent, but because he had never been given the spotlight in the Beatles. The album revealed just how much he had been holding back. It was as if years of quiet growth and creative frustration had finally burst forth in a wave of music that felt both deeply personal and universally resonant. But success came with complications. In 1971, My Sweet Lord became the center of a legal dispute when the publisher of the song He's So Fine by the Chiffons claimed Harrison had plagiarized it. The court eventually ruled that Harrison had subconsciously copied the earlier song's melody. While Harrison accepted the judgment, the experience left him disillusioned. He would later write about it in a satirical song called This Song, which appeared on his 1976 album 33 and 1/3. Despite the legal troubles, Harrison stayed focused on making music and deepening his commitment to spirituality and humanitarian work. That same year, 1971, he organized the Concert for Bangladesh, the first major benefit concert of its kind. Sparked by the humanitarian crisis caused by the Bangladesh Liberation War and subsequent refugee emergency, the concert featured performances by Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Ravi Shankar, Ringo Starr, and others. It took place at Madison Square Garden in New York and raised millions for UNICEF and awareness of the situation in South Asia. The Concert for Bangladesh was groundbreaking. Long before Live Aid or charity megaconcerts became common, Harrison used his platform to draw attention to a global crisis. It showed that a musician could do more than entertain. They could influence public awareness and galvanize action. The accompanying live album and film continued to raise funds for years afterwards, despite complications with taxes and legal logistics that slowed some of the aid distribution. This period of George's life was marked by intense spiritual focus. He became deeply involved with the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, also known as the Hare Krishna movement. While he never officially became a devotee, Harrison financially supported the organization, helped fund temples, and produced the single Hare Krishna Mantra by the Radha Krishna Temple, which charted in the UK in 1969. He also included the chant in his own music, and his home, Friar Park, became something of a spiritual sanctuary. In the years that followed, Harrison released a string of solo albums. While none reached the same cultural or commercial heights as All Things Must Pass, many of them contained strong material and moments of insight. Albums like Living in the Material World, 1973, Dark Horse, 1973, and 33 and 1/3, 1976, explored themes of devotion, fame, human frailty, and disillusionment with the entertainment industry. And in fairness, he did too. It took him. He wasn't trying to recreate Beatlemania. Instead, he was forging his own, quieter, more introspective path. Not everything during this period was smooth. Harrison's 1974 North American tour, which he co-headlined with Ravi Shankar, was met with mixed reviews. Critics complained about his strained vocals, the heavy spiritual messaging, and the absence of Beatles songs in the setlist. George had been recovering from laryngitis, which impacted his voice throughout the tour, and his decision to distance himself from Beatles nostalgia wasn't universally appreciated by fans. Still, Harrison continued to evolve. He wasn't afraid to take risks, even if they weren't always well received. His songwriting remained a reflection of his internal state, searching, thoughtful, often tinged with melancholy or critique. Unlike many of his peers, George didn't seem overly interested in maintaining a public image. He valued privacy and authenticity over fame. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, Harrison gradually stepped back from the spotlight. He spent more time gardening, tending to his estate, and investing in film. In 1978, he co-founded Handmade Films, a production company that began almost by accident. When the Monty Python comedy Life of Brian lost its original financing, Harrison stepped in to fund it, largely because he wanted to see the movie get made. Handmade went on to produce a string of successful British films, including Time Bandits, Mona Lisa, and With Nail and I. During this quieter chapter of his life, George released the album Somewhere in England, 1981, which featured the single All Those Years Ago, a tribute to John Lennon following his assassination in December 1980. The song was a heartfelt reflection on friendship, loss, and the profound impact Lennon had left on Harrison and the world. Ringo Starr played drums on the track, and Paul McCartney provided backing vocals, creating a moment of Beatles reunion, even if under tragic circumstances. Harrison's next album, Gone Tropo, 1982, was less visible and received only modest attention. At that point, he had largely retreated from music, tired of the promotional grind and media circus that came with album releases. He focused instead on his personal life, including raising his son, Dhani, who was born in 1978. But by the late 1980s, Harrison made a return to music with renewed energy. In 1987, he released Cloud 9, an album that marked a significant comeback. The lead single, Got My Mind Set on You, became a hit in both the UK and the US, buoyed by a fun, quirky music video that appealed to the MTV generation. The album also included tracks like When We Was Fab, a nostalgic but slightly satirical look back at Beatlemania. It also became an insurable success, selling 33.6 million with a 26.5% critical. Around this time, George formed the Travelling Wilburys, a supergroup that included Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, Jeff Lynne, and Roy Orbison. What began as a casual collaboration for a B-side turned into a full-fledged project. Their debut album, Travelling Wilburys Volume 1, 1988, was critically acclaimed and commercially successful. The group had a relaxed, joyful chemistry, and for Harrison it was a way to make music without the weight of expectation or legacy. The Wilburys represented a playful chapter in his career, one defined by friendship, shared admiration, and creative freedom. Through the 1990s, Harrison continued to live largely out of the public eye. He was involved in the Beatles Anthology project, which reunited the surviving members to reflect on their legacy. The project also included the release of 2 new Beatles songs, Free as a Bird and Real Love, built from old Lennon demos and finished by McCartney, Harrison, and Starr. It was a bittersweet moment, blending nostalgia with the finality of the Beatles' story. In 1997, Harrison was diagnosed with throat cancer, which he initially overcame. But the illness returned, and in the years that followed, he began to face his mortality with characteristic calm and reflection. He spent his final years surrounded by family and close friends, working on music when his health allowed. Even during treatment, he remained grounded in his spiritual beliefs, speaking often about the impermanence of life and the importance of preparing for what comes after. George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58. His final moments were reportedly peaceful, marked by the chants of Hare Krishna devotees and the presence of loved ones. In the days that followed, tributes poured in from across the world. Fans, fellow musicians, and public figures spoke not just about his music, but about his kindness, his humor, and his sense of integrity. In the years since his death, Harrison's legacy has only grown. He's remembered not just as a Beatle, but as an artist who quietly challenged the norms of celebrity and success. He carved out a space for spiritual reflection in pop culture, blending Eastern and Western ideas long before it was fashionable. His music continues to resonate, not through bombast, but through sincerity, beauty, and a deeply human search for meaning. George Harrison's influence extended far beyond his years as a Beatle and solo artist. While many remember him primarily for his guitar work and songwriting within the Beatles, his legacy touches on numerous facets: spirituality, humanitarianism, musical innovation, and a personal quest for meaning that resonated with millions. One of the most significant ways Harrison changed the musical landscape was by introducing Indian music and culture to Western audiences. In the mid-1960s, as the Beatles' fame exploded, George became fascinated by Indian instruments, philosophy, and spirituality. This interest began around 1965, when the band met Indian sitar player Ravi Shankar. Harrison was captivated by the sound of the sitar, which he first played on the Beatles' track Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, from the Rubber Soul album. This song marked one of the first times a traditional Indian instrument was used in Western pop music. Harrison's deepening relationship with Shankar went beyond mere musical collaboration. He studied sitar and Indian classical music under Shankar's tutelage, immersing himself in a culture that contrasted sharply with the Western lifestyle the Beatles lived. This interest was not a passing phase. It shaped much of Harrison's worldview and creative output. His songs often reflected the spiritual teachings he absorbed from Hinduism and other Eastern traditions. The Beatles' 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band featured the Indian-influenced track Within You, Without You, which Harrison wrote and performed almost entirely with Indian musicians. This was a bold departure from the band's typical sound and introduced millions of listeners to new musical possibilities. The song's lyrics delve into philosophical themes about illusion, ego, and unity, reflecting Harrison's interest in Indian spirituality. Beyond music, Harrison's engagement with spirituality was genuine and deeply personal. He was one of the first Western rock stars to openly embrace Hinduism and the teachings of the Hare Krishna movement. His involvement helped bring attention to this spiritual tradition, which was relatively unknown in the West during the 1960s and 1970s. Harrison's faith informed much of his life decisions, music, and philanthropic work. Throughout his solo career, Harrison incorporated spiritual and religious themes into his songs. Tracks like My Sweet Lord explicitly celebrated his devotion, combining Christian and Hindu elements in a way that felt inclusive and universal. The song's success highlighted a public openness to spirituality in popular music, at a time when rock and roll was often associated with rebellion and secularism. Harrison's spiritual journey was also reflected in his lifestyle. He sought simplicity and peace, often retreating from the excesses of the music industry. His home, Friar Park, was a sanctuary, filled with gardens, statues, and symbols representing his beliefs. Harrison's approach contrasted with the celebrity culture of the time, which often glorified extravagance and hedonism. This sense of peace and purpose carried over into his humanitarian efforts. Harrison used his platform to raise awareness and funds for causes he believed in, most notably the Concert for Bangladesh. This event was a milestone in the history of benefit concerts. It demonstrated that musicians could leverage their fame to make a positive impact on global issues, inspiring future charitable efforts like Live Aid and Farm Aid. The concert also underscored Harrison's ability to bring together diverse artists for a common cause. The lineup included some of the biggest names in music, and the event's success proved that collaboration could transcend personal and professional differences. For Harrison, it was not about self-promotion, but about using music as a vehicle for compassion and change. Musically, Harrison was more than just a spiritual guide or activist. He was a skilled and innovative guitarist. His style blended traditional rock with Indian melodies, blues, and folk influences. He helped expand the sonic possibilities of the Beatles and later of popular music in general. His work on songs like While My Guitar Gently Weeps and Here Comes the Sun showcased his melodic sensibility and emotional depth. Harrison's guitar playing was distinctive, not flashy or overly technical, but expressive and tasteful. He knew when to support a song with subtle textures and when to step forward with memorable solos. This approach influenced countless guitarists who came after him. Artists and critics alike have often praised his ability to communicate feeling through his instrument. He writes, "With this instrument, aside from his musical and spiritual legacy, Harrison's personality left a lasting impression. He was known for his quiet demeanor, dry wit, and a grounded outlook on fame and fortune. Unlike some of his contemporaries, he didn't chase the spotlight or crave public adulation. Instead, he maintained a low profile, valuing authenticity and personal growth over commercial success. This approach helped Harrison navigate the challenges of celebrity. The Beatles' sudden and overwhelming fame had taken a toll on all its members, but Harrison's spiritual practice provided a framework for coping with stress, conflict, and change. His experiences showed that it was possible to balance a public career with private fulfillment. The complex relationship between Harrison and the other Beatles also shaped his life story. While the band's breakup was difficult, he found opportunities to express himself creatively without compromise. At times, he collaborated with John Lennon and Paul McCartney after the Beatles, but he also forged his own path. The Traveling Wilburys project in the late 1990s, 1980s was an example of his desire to make music on his own terms, fun, collaborative, and free from the pressures of his past. Harrison's later years were marked by reflection and resilience. His battle with cancer was fought with quiet courage, and he remained thoughtful about the meaning of life and death. Friends and family have described him as peaceful in his final days, accepting of the natural cycle of existence. After his death, Harrison's music and message continued to resonate. Posthumous releases, reissues, and tribute concerts introduced his work to new generations. His son Danny Harrison has also carried forward his father's musical heritage, participating in tribute projects and preserving George's legacy. Harrison's influence can be seen in many areas today. Musicians cite him as an inspiration for blending genres and exploring spiritual themes in their work. Charity concerts and artist-led humanitarian efforts owe a debt to the example he set. Even in popular culture, references to Harrison's life and music remind audiences of a time when rock and roll could be a force for introspection and global awareness. In the broader context of 20th century music, George Harrison occupies a unique place. He was not the most dominant or prolific member of the Beatles, but his contributions were essential to the band's evolution and to the shaping of modern popular music. His fusion of East and West, his pioneering use of non-Western instruments, and his commitment to sincere expression made him a trailblazer. Ultimately, Harrison's story is one of transformation, from a young boy in Liverpool fascinated by American rock and roll to an international icon who bridged cultures and philosophies. His journey reflected a search for truth and connection. His music remains a testament to that quest, inviting listeners to explore their own paths beyond the noise of everyday life. George Harrison's life shows that artistic success need not come at the cost of personal integrity. His willingness to follow his own voice, even when it diverged from popular trends or expectations, is a powerful example. Whether through a shimmering guitar riff, a heartfelt song, or a charitable act, his impact endures, a quiet but lasting influence on the world of music and beyond.